Now let's tackle darts. And I've seen some videos where people have completely ignored that their clothing is darts, and you can't ignore darts, especially bust darts and the darts that come down from the waist because they make room for your bum. So I'm going to show you how to trace a relatively simple triangular dart at the bust, and I'll be copying one of my favourite pieces of clothing, which is this bias cut top here, which I made the pattern for a designer about like over a decade ago now. For a simple triangular bust dart, like the one on this top, I'd use the paper and pencil pin or tracing wheel method. So I just find my centre line by folding the piece in half so the seams are on top of each other. And the top is a bit fiddly because it's on the bias, plus the fabric is quite slippery and thick, so the seams are a bit bulky. Anyway, when I have my centre line, I'll put some pins along it. See how I'm sort of holding the side seam here and then smoothing out from it? I have to be very careful because my fabric is slipping and moving around quite a lot. So I'm checking the side seam and then lightly pulling the fabric out towards the center to find the center line. So I wouldn't usually do this, but I'm actually going to trace my top on the fold. My fabric is just really slippery and it's on the bias, so it's moving around a lot. So I'm worried if I unfold it, I won't be able to get a very accurate reading. So I wouldn't usually do it, but this time I'm doing it on the fold. Now, I'll grab a piece of pattern paper big enough for the whole front of the top and draw a line down the center. This is going to be my center line, and it would usually be the grain line, but I'm doing a bias top, so I'd actually draw a different grain line, but usually it'd be the center line and your grain line. Then I'll pin the center line on my top on top of the center line of my pattern. The important thing to remember about copying clothes using the paper method is your piece of clothing needs to be flat. When you aren't able to get it flat anymore, stop. So I'm just pinning along the center line till about the bust dart. The bust dart is creating all the shaping and curving on the clothing, so I can't get it flat. So I stop here on the center line, but then I can pin the rest of the top below the bust dart to the paper. I can get this whole section flat. Then I'll fold the back of the top over to reveal the side seam here. I'm just pulling the fabric lightly so it's taut and drawing next to the seam. And I'll stop at the dart here. Then I'll draw along the hem and put a notch at the top of the slit here. Then I'll pull back the fabric and mark the dart point, so where the dart is finishing, and draw along the dart leg. Then I'm going to unpin my top so I can get inside and measure the width of the dart at the seam, so how wide it is, and it's 1.3 centimeters. This is just half the measurement though, because the dart is folded in half, so I need to double the measurement, which is 2.6 centimeters. And I'll measure this distance and mark a point 2.6 centimeters away from the dart leg I drew. This point will become the other side of my dart. Then I'll unpin the lower section so I can rotate the piece and copy the top half. And I'm going to put a pin at the bust point here. Bust point, not dart point. The bust point is usually 2 centimeters away, so 3/4 of an inch from the dart point. I don't want this point to move, because essentially I'm rotating the piece around this bust point. Then I'll unpin the rest of the bottom section and rotate the piece. When I rotate it, I need to make sure the dart is now touching the mark I drew on my paper, which was 2.6 centimeters away. This will ensure that the dart is the correct size. Then I'll pin along the armhole and neckline, making sure the piece is nice and flat at the top, and I'm pinning just slightly back from the bound edge. Before I copy the top half, I'll just double check the dart is lined up correctly, and it is. Then I'll fold back the lace and draw along the neckline, and I'll spend a bit of time making sure I get this intersection right. Then I'll carefully pull back the binding and draw along the armhole. Then I'll draw the rest of my side seam. Then I'll remove my top and use my ruler to draw the dart legs, which are both straight. And I'll use my ruler again to create a nice smooth neckline here. But I'm going to draw the armhole freehand. You could use a French curve if you want to. Then I'll use my ruler again to smooth out the side seam here and make sure this notch marking the top of my slit is really clear. Now, I just need to check my dart legs are the same length, which I'll do by folding my paper along the dart and checking the side seams match. Just so you know, this dart is a bit smaller than the normal bust dart because this top is on the bias. Ooh, and they don't. So I'm just going to adjust the bottom dart leg here. Why the bottom dart leg? Well, if I brought the top dart leg out, the side seam would be really straight at the top, and I want it to curve in. See how the line looks really nice now? It looks like the shape of a body. And I'll just draw the dart folds at the side seam here, making sure they're the same shape as the side seam. So you need to check which way the dart on your top is folded first, so whether it folds up or down. And my pattern is done. All it needs now is the seam and hem allowances. But one point before I show you more complex darts, I chose to do the bottom half first because my bust to hem length was longer than my bust to neck measurement, because my top has a V-neck. But if your top or dress has a higher neckline and a proper armhole, you can do that first. The important thing is that you have a large enough area that you can use to start your pattern off, and then you can rotate it at the dart. That was how to trace a relatively simple dart, and you can see it's a lot easier when you can get inside the garment and measure how wide the dart is. But what do you do if the dart is shaped, or if the seam allowance has been trimmed off, or there are lots of style lines? This is when the interfacing method is really handy. And I use the interfacing method for when designs are complex, so lots of style lines, or when I couldn't get a tracing wheel through a piece. So this jacket, it's got the woolen fabric, shoulder pads, lining. It'd be really hard to actually get a pin or tracing wheel through there. And also the shoulder pads kind of distorted a bit, so it wouldn't really be accurate. Plus it's also got dart here, pockets. So when the designs are complex, I use the interfacing method. This is how I do it. Okay, so this is how I do the interfacing method. And I like to do the interfacing method on a mannequin. Why? Because I use it for more contoured pieces. So these pieces that I can't get flat onto a table. Some people do interfacing method on a table, but I find if you're trying to do something contoured, if you've got it on a table, like a flat surface, you'll be pushing the contours out to lay the interfacing on top. So why not just put it on a body, and then the mannequin is actually pushing the fabric out in the place where it wants to be. Just makes it a lot easier. So I always use interfacing method on a mannequin, and then I'll just draw my grain line somewhere. So once again, because interfacing is a fabric, you kind of want to treat it like a fabric, so you want to make sure it's on grain. So you look for a place that on the pattern that would be on grain. So I know this sort of edge of the lapel here will be on grain. But if you're doing something that you're not too sure, like the back here, you can either draw a grain line and then try and match it to a grain line on the fabric there. You have to sort of, like we did with the paper method, you have to sort of look for straight lines that'll be on grain or the center line, so you can create your method tracing. So what I'll do is I'll just pin the grain line to the edge here. Then I might just put a pin here just to hold it in place. And then I'll just start smoothing it up. So get down here. And because it is a fabric and it's very delicate, you want to make sure that firstly what your piece of clothing isn't, that it's lying flat, and also the interfacing is lying flat. It's really easy for one of them to maybe be a bit warped, and if either one of them isn't completely flat when you put the pins in, it means your pattern isn't going to be correct. So you really want to be pushing it down, and so you just keep going up and up and up, keeping it smooth and taut. And like we did, because this jacket's got a dart in it, as well as some pockets, like we did with the top, just try and make sure that you're getting the flat areas first. So don't start with the dart. Try and get the parameters of the piece first, and then we'll do the dart last, because that'll have some shaping. Not necessarily pinning at the seams here like I was with the other one. I'm pinning throughout. This just helps me keep it really flat. And you'll want to make sure when you do a jacket that you copy the break line. So you can't see it underneath here, but this is called the break line there. It's just a good reference to have on your pattern. So say if something does go a bit off, you know where that break line is, and that can help you reconstruct it. And remember, we always stop at the seams, even for interfacing. So there's the edge of that's where the lapel finishes and the collar starts. That's as far as I'll go. And see, it's getting a bit crumply here. So when you go around curves, often you'll need to snip into it. Same when you're doing draping. The important thing is you don't want to snip too far though, because obviously once you release that, you can't get it back together again. So before you start snipping into a corner to relieve tension in the fabric, make sure you've got the point right. And another great thing with interfacing is that you can sort of actually get your finger and just kind of get into the seams there. So not only can you draw them, you can actually sort of mark them with your finger, which is quite handy. So I'll mark the side seam and armhole as well, and I need to get my hand in here just to push that out a bit. So my style line for the jacket is in here, and you can see that I've actually got that little bit of excess there. So that would be my style line dart. This is why the interfacing is quite useful method. So I'd pin out that excess like I was if I was doing a dart and just mark it. So when I create my pattern, I'll obviously open that up and turn it into a dart. And I'll pin that all the way down. And the dart's quite small because it's quite a boxy, oversized jacket. And I'll mark it down to the pocket here. Because the pocket, it's kind of like a style line here. So I'll pin that all the way down. And I'm not going to increase the dart up to this point. So when I create my pattern, I'm actually going to close that dart. This will make sense when I show you how to make the pattern. But essentially, just pinning all this excess down. So once I'm happy with how the interfacing is looking, everything's looking good, I can grab a marker. I'm going to use a purple vanishing one because I don't want to damage my fabric, but however you want to mark. And I'll just draw around all my seams, the edges here. I'll mark any buttons. I'll mark this dart excess, armholes, side seams, and the hem, obviously. Once I'm done, I'll remove the interfacing from the jacket and grab a piece of paper big enough for the entire pattern piece. The pattern needs to be on grain, so I'm drawing a line in the corner here, and I'll lay that first straight line I drew on the interfacing. Remember that line I drew before I even put the interfacing on the mannequin? I knew the edge of the lapel here was on grain, so I anchored my interfacing there and made sure the interfacing was on grain at that point too. But your grain line or center line could be somewhere else, so just wherever it is on your interfacing, try and find the same location on the paper so you can match it on top. Then I'll pin the interfacing to the paper. I'll start at the corner here and smooth out the interfacing till it's nice and flat, and then pin it in place. Then I'll use a tracing wheel to draw over my seams. Once you've traced all the lines, you can remove the interfacing and draw over all the lines with a pencil. Okay, I think my top section looks pretty good shape-wise. I'm going to focus on the darts in this demonstration, but I would check the armhole, shoulder and collar measurements against my jacket to make sure everything matches. And I've drawn the break line here, which is where the jacket lapel folds over. So I want to check my button and buttonhole positioning, the pocket length here and my dart. This lower section of the dart, I'm actually going to close it. I obviously couldn't just pin the top half of the dart on the interfacing and finish the pocket because it'd have a massive bit of fabric there. So I had to close it all the way down. But now I'm going to remove this on my pattern, which I'll show you how to do in a second. See how the dart finishes at the pocket and there isn't anything below? This is what my pattern should look like, and it will. Ooh, I actually forgot to mark this pocket detailing, but I can do it later. I'll just lay my pattern on top of the jacket and mark it. I also need to add the width of that pocket opening here, which I'll show you how to do too. Now let's check the buttonhole placement. So I'll measure the distance from the edge, which is 1.5 centimeters, and mark that distance on my pattern. Actually, my bottom buttonhole is looking more accurate than my top, so let's check the distance between them is correct, and it is. Then I'll measure the buttonhole length, which is 2.5 centimeters, and mark it on my pattern. Then I'll check my button placement. The button is in line with the buttonhole here, and it's 12.5 centimeters from the edge. So I'll mark the buttons with a large circle about the size of the button and draw a cross in the middle. The middle of the cross should be where the button will be sewn. Now I'm going to mark my center front. It's always good to mark the center front on your pattern. It's just a really good reference, especially when you've got lapels and buttons. And I know the center front is always in the middle of the two buttons, and the second button is here. So I'll just measure the distance from them, and it's 10.5 centimeters between them, and mark the center. Then I'll draw a perpendicular line along it, and this is my center line. Now I'm going to check the length of my hem. This will tell me whether I've closed the dart correctly at the bottom here. The hem of my jacket is 34.8 centimeters, and the total length of my pattern, including the section I need to close, is 37.8 centimeters. This means I need to close 4 centimeters at the bottom here. I'm just looking at my pattern now. I'm not sure exactly where to mark those points right now, so I'll just make a note to close it by 4 centimeters, Once I check the dart above, I'll be able to get a better idea. Now let's check the pocket length, and it's 14 centimeters. So let's check how long it is on the pattern. Ooh, and it's 15.5 centimeters. This means I need to take off 1.5 centimeters somewhere. So let's check the small section here is correct. Yes, this is 1.5 centimeters on my jacket and my pattern. So I'm going to take off 1.5 centimeters on the other side here. Now I'll check my dart length, which is 20 centimeters. And this is actually a fair bit higher than what I marked. So let's double check. Yep, if you look at my jacket, the dart finishes at about the underarm here. And when I extend it on the pattern, it finishes at the same point. Now I'll connect the dart point with the base here. And I'll just put a drill hole in the center. So I've got 2 points to match together when I'm sewing. And I'll put a drill hole at the top. Now let's mark the pocket and the cut line. When I copied the jacket, I actually traced the width of this little flap here, but I don't actually need this on my pattern. It's a separate piece. What I actually need is the cut line for the pocket here. So let's measure the distance, and it's 1 centimeter. Then I'll mark 1 centimeter away from the top line here on my pattern. The cut line should be in the center of this 1 centimeter seam allowance, so mine's a bit off, so I'll just rub it out and put it in the center. When you create your jacket, you would actually cut along this line here. Essentially, it's like a Y cut line, like on a shirt vent. So I need to add drill holes at all the key corners so I know where to snip to. I also need to add a drill hole at the base of the dart here so I can match those points to sew my dart. Actually, let me show you. So you cut along here, right up into the drill hole, then you stop and snip into the corners. This allows you to sew the dart and to insert the pocket bag and flaps. Now I need to close this section here so the bottom of the pocket is the same length as the top. The total dart width is 3.5 centimeters, but I need to close 4 centimeters at the bottom. So I'm just going to place my ruler at the end of the first dart leg and draw a straight-ish line to the hem. Then I'll mark a point 4 centimeters away at the hem and draw a line connecting that point with the end of the second dart leg. Then, to close this section, I'll fold the paper along the first line here and lie it on top of the other line. And that's the hard part done. My pattern is sitting nice and flat and looks like my jacket, and the seam along the pockets all match up. Now I just need to add my seam allowances. Before the hem, I'll just measure the jacket, and it's 3 centimeters visible seam allowance, but it's sewn to lining, so I'll need an extra 1 centimeter seam allowance to attach it. So I'll draw a 4 centimeter seam allowance along the hem. So you can see this method does take longer, but if your design is complex, so a dress with style lines or a tailored jacket, you will get better, more accurate results using this method. But I would still check my work, so remember to measure the key seams, like dart lengths, pocket lengths if you're doing jackets, and make sure your pattern matches the clothing. If you like making patterns from your clothes, check out the other videos in this series, and subscribe to my channel for more pattern cutting videos.